Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Tess Stanton. Judge Anita Schutte was appointed to the Denver District Court in June of 2022 and currently presides over a domestic relations docket. Prior to her appointment, she represented the Colorado Department of Human Services at the Colorado Attorney General's office, served as a municipal court judge, as a public defender, and represented children with disabilities. Judge Schutte has a severe hearing loss and recently co-founded the Colorado Disability Bar Association alongside Judge Johnson. She received her law degree in 2003 from Whittier Law School and her bachelor's from the University of Colorado at Denver in 2000. She's a first-generation college student. Judge Sueanna P. Johnson was appointed to the Colorado Court of Appeals in December 2019. Before her appointment, she was employed with the Colorado Attorney General's office, first as an assistant attorney general, then as a senior assistant attorney general in the business and licensing section. While at the Colorado Attorney General's office, she also worked in the state services section and served on the internal ethics and fellowship committees. She obtained her Juris Doctor from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2003 and earned her bachelor's in political science from Colorado College in 1997. As a person with albinism and a visual impairment, she's also a member of the National Organization of Albinism and Hypopigmentation. Judge Johnson was born in Seoul, South Korea, and adopted when she was 3 years old. Hi, Judge Schutte and Judge Johnson. I'm so excited to be talking to you both today. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Good morning.
So could you start out by telling our listeners about yourselves and your background and your relation to disability?
So I graduated from law school in 2003 with a Center for Children's Rights certificate. Before I became a judge, I was a public defender, municipal court judge, and I spent years representing children with disabilities who had discipline issues with their school districts or weren't receiving services or had been charged with, juvenile delinquency acts that were based on their disability. I spent 10 years with the Attorney General's office before taking the bench, where I represented the Department of Human Services and all of those state agencies. So the state mental health hospitals, youth corrections, the veterans homes, things like that. I have a severe bilateral hearing loss. It's genetic and progressive. So eventually I'll be nearly, if not completely deaf.
Hi, my name is Sueanna Johnson. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and adopted when I was 3 to parents who are natives to Colorado. I have a condition called oculocutaneous albinism, which means I don't produce melanin. So I have white hair, blue eyes, and very light skin. And attendant to that condition, you need melanin to produce rods and cones in your eyes. And so it affects my vision. I'm about 2400 and it's non-correctable. I went to law school at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And before I got appointed to the bench, I also worked at the Attorney General's office. That's pretty much where I worked before I was appointed. I represented the governor for a while. I represented the Colorado Division of Insurance. I did a lot of securities fraud cases. And then kind of the latter part of my tenure, I represented the Office of the Child Protection Ombudsman, as well as a new agency called the Office of Public Guardianship. And then I was appointed in December of 2009 by Governor Jared Polis.
Excellent. Well, I'm also a CU graduate. I believe you are too, Judge Schutte. Is that correct?
CU Denver. Yes.
CU Denver. Well, go CU. Well, thank you so much for kind of sharing that background with us. And the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and the other ADA centers, we're not enforcement agencies, but rather we provide information, guidance, and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So because we're not an enforcement agency, our work oftentimes ends where yours begins as judicial officers. So I'm so interested to hear any stories that you're able to share about how the ADA has impacted your work or vice versa.
I am a judge in the Colorado Court of Appeals. So for your listeners, Judge Schutte is district court judge. So that's where you see most courtroom dramas where you have a judge and a jury and 2 attorneys who are putting in evidence and there's a witness. And then there's always one side that's unhappy and they go take it to the appellate court. And so that's where I sit. And the extent of where I have mostly seen the ADA come up is in juvenile dependency and neglect cases where a child is put into the system on allegations of neglect or abuse, and the parents are confronting possible termination of their parental rights. And in the course of those proceedings, the parent has alleged or has been discovered to have some type of disability. And under case law in Colorado, the Department of Human Services has to provide reasonable accommodations to those parents so that they can try to comply with their treatment plans in the hopes of avoiding the termination of their parental rights. And those cases are really difficult because usually when they come to us at the appellate court, there's oftentimes very little that can be done based upon what the juvenile court has determined. And so, those cases are difficult too, because you do see that those parents have some pretty significant disabilities, but it's hard to determine, that if to the extent they were given reasonable accommodations, that the fact that they are or have a qualified disability doesn't immune them from termination of parental rights. So that's where I've seen it most in the cases that I've confronted since being on the bench.
So I am a newer judge. I was appointed by Governor Polis in June and took the bench in August. And right now I preside over a domestic relations docket, which includes some civil appeals from the county court and from agency decisions. The only area I have seen it come up in my courtroom so far is when litigants need accommodations. So we have an ADA coordinator. Each district has an ADA coordinator. So I haven't seen anyone request accommodations, but I have seen a couple of litigants come in and it was clear to me that they needed accommodations. There was two litigants now who are living with dyslexia. And so they, when we reach out to the ADA coordinator, they have people that can help assist in the courtroom, help them review, pleadings, help them, write down what it is that they want to file, because the large majority of the litigants in my courtroom are pro se parties, meaning they're not represented. They don't have attorneys. So those resources are available to them. I'm very proactive about if I sense that someone may need them, letting them know that that's available. And on occasion, we have people with intellectual disabilities. I've had 2 cases where individuals required a guardian ad litem because they just simply weren't able to understand the proceedings based on their disabilities. So that's where I've seen it so far in my courtroom.
And I also wanted to ask, on top of those professional experiences, do you have any personal experiences with the ADA that you'd be comfortable sharing with us today? We can start with Judge Johnson.
I was born before and went to elementary school before the passage of the ADA. I did go to a school for the visually impaired. And, so I didn't have a lot of experience until for my formative, even during was passed in 1990, even in college. I didn't really need a lot of accommodations. At that point, I had kind of figured out how to self-accommodate. Since then, I've had some experiences where, basically I would say I wasn't like denied accessibility, but it was like kind of a barrier in terms of a teacher saying you shouldn't take a class because you're not going to be able to see the board, or a law professor saying I couldn't use my laptop because he prohibited laptops. And so I don't want to say insignificant, but I mean, it was not some of the stories that you've probably heard where, people are really having challenges in accessing their schools or services that they should be and are entitled to. I think the thing that I've really tried to do in terms of when I was a litigant, though, as a lawyer, is I would make it very clear to the judge when I went into court that I'm not going to be able to see you. So if you give me any nonverbal communication, like you wave your hand or you're looking at me strangely because you think my argument really is horrible, I'm not going to be able to see that. And I made that very clear just because there are such rules in the courtroom that, when the judge starts talking or you sense the judge wants to say something, you're supposed to kind of defer. I never really had an issue with that. And actually, I would say that opposing counsel was always very gracious and understood, like, if I needed to see an exhibit that I hadn't had to see before. So, I think the profession in Colorado, the legal profession in Colorado is for the most part supportive. I just think that there's a lot of education that still needs to be had about more and more lawyers as they come into the practice who have like neurodivergent disabilities or other, types of disabilities that aren't as readily understood, like, mobility, vision, hearing loss.
Absolutely. And how about you, Judge Schutte?
Similar experience, just Judge Johnson and I are around the same age, and I didn't, in the special education in terms of, they made sure that the deaf and hard of hearing students, were receiving accommodations in the classroom, but I didn't really, because my hearing loss is progressive, only more recently in the last few years has it really required more accommodations outside of my self-accommodations. I had one instance, which is what led me to reach out to Judge Johnson, where I was effectively cut out of a court proceeding after asking a judge to move his hand from his mouth because he had his I read lips, or to speak into the microphone. And his reaction was to do neither. And it was very embarrassing. And, it angered me. Interestingly, I think Judge Johnson and I have talked about this, that even as lawyers with disabilities, we're not experts in the ADA. I have learned more about the ADA since we co-formed this disability bar than I knew before, because we have, members that have joined our group that are experts, and we have, presented CLEs with them. It did cross over into my work with children and the school districts. IDEA was, primarily what we were focused on, but certainly ADA, is implicated there. Certainly I knew what I needed to know when representing those children about what ADA required. But in my personal life, not until recently was it something that I have become more attuned to.
And I wanted to ask more, Judge Schutte, about the Colorado Disability Bar Association and the story behind how it was formed.
That is the story, essentially, that, there was that incident. At the time, I was still applying to be a judge. And I noticed that when they were recruiting diverse candidates, disability was not one of the factors that they were really looking at. So after that experience, I reached out to Judge Johnson. We worked together at the AG's office, and I said, "Hey, I've been thinking about this, and I've done some research. Has not been a disability bar in Colorado. There had been some, across the country. There was some interesting history with some of them and we've talked about this in our group, where they will form, but then they will branch off because the number of disabilities and the needs of the various individuals with disabilities is just it varies so much that they end up splitting off into like a deaf and hard of hearing bar or visually impaired." And so I reached out to her and said, "I think this is a need in Colorado. What do you think?" And she was like, "Absolutely." And we had a few meetings, and honestly, Judge Johnson has a gift of recruiting talented people. And so I pitched it, but she really got that ball rolling. And we got, I think we first spoke to the women's bar. Is that right, Judge Johnson? That was our first CLE. And
Yes.
From there, people started, because the word was getting out, people started to notice, and we started to speak more. And now, how many members do we have now, Judge Johnson?
45, 50.
So we're in the process of incorporating right now.
That's excellent. And Judge Johnson, I want to know from you, what efforts does the Colorado Disability Bar Association have in the works right now?
Well, last night we actually just did a presentation where it was like lawyers have to get continuing legal education requirements every year. And so we just did a presentation where there was what we call an ADA expert. So somebody who actually practices in the disability field, who presents on the ADA. And then we have a panel of members who can range from lawyers to law students to judicial officers who talk about their experiences being a lawyer with a disability or being on the bench with a disability. So we've done probably about 10 to 15 presentations like that, as Judge Schutte noted, the first being with the Colorado Women's Bar Association. When Judge Schutte brought this idea to me, it really astounded me that in 2023, while we have a Women's Bar Association in Colorado, we have a bar for Asian Pacific Americans, Black lawyers, Hispanics, and Latinx, LGBTQ, that there isn't one for disability. And I can see why, given some of the things that Judge Schutte referred to in terms of just how diverse the group is and the needs. And we've even seen some of that already in our group. It's always an education for us to learn. You may know about your own disability, but you have no idea what other people face. And so that has been really eye-opening. These presentations, I think what we really focus on is, and we did this last night, is one of the questions that we always ask the panelists to kind of opine on for the audience is, what benefits does a lawyer with a disability bring to the profession? Why should you hire somebody with a disability in your law firm or appoint them to the bench? And the characteristics that we get are they are wide ranging. I mean, I think oftentimes probably in your work, you realize that in doing education, a lot of times it's like the concept of the ADA of like an undue burden and a reasonable accommodation. And how much is this going to cost me as an employer? And, is this person going to be as efficient? And so instead of that burden, we're talking about the benefits, such as, being overprepared because we have to self-accommodate, thinking outside the box and being creative and problem solving because of that self-accommodation, thinking differently and seeing differently because you're on the autism spectrum or you have a neurodivergent disability that allows you to see legal issues or principles in a different way and solve problems, being more efficient and organized in your work because you have ADHD or some disability that causes bodily fatigue. And so you can't kind of just wander off and think about all the things that we sometimes do as lawyers. And so that is something that we're really trying to educate the bar about, because I think that's something that often is missing in the conversation, instead of thinking, well, what am I going to have to do versus what are they going to actually bring to us that we haven't necessarily seen.
And a quote that stood out for me from your article, The Colorado Disability Bar Association and Diversity Bar in the Making, says you both recognize the value that people with disabilities bring to the practice of law, but also acknowledge the barriers those same people can face in your profession. And so even, outside of disability, why do you think diversity is important on the bench and in your profession? We'll start with you, Judge Schutte.
If you are in front, usually people are in court in one of the worst times in their lives. They're charged with a crime. They're facing their loss of liberty. They're getting a divorce. They're being sued for And when you walk into the courtroom and you only see white men, I think by human nature, you are going to believe that person sitting in front of you doesn't understand what your circumstance is like. I can say I've been pretty open with my background. I had to go to court for truancy when I was a kid. I had a challenging childhood, and I saw the judge, and it was a white male judge. And I remembered believing, why is he going to listen to a teenager who's struggling, that he has no idea what my life is like, as a person that with privileges that others don't. Imagine, walking into a courtroom where, you're a person of color and every judge you've ever seen is white. And what happens in regards to race in our justice system. So to have people on the bench that represent the communities that they serve, it will just automatically make people feel like, okay, this judge will understand at least somewhat, right? And so I'm really open with my disability too. I think that I've noticed since we started this effort, people that I work with were more willing to open up about their own disabilities. I think that a key part is disabilities aren't always visible. And when you're educating people on disabilities, it opens up people's eyes a little bit to be aware that, someone in front of you, someone that you're working with, may have a disability. My disability is not one you can see because I learned to speak before I lost my hearing. Mm-hmm. So it's not noticeable. But so a lot of times I think people might wonder, is she not listening? Is she not paying attention? Is she not very bright? These are things that come up for people with invisible disabilities. So anyway, that's sort of a rambling response to, you need people that represent the community, people with disabilities, people of color. You need women, you need LGBTQ judges, because you need to feel like your perspective is represented in our court.
I think there's a forward-facing importance for disability on the bench, just like Judge Schutte noted, in terms of, when those people come into the courtroom and see somebody or hear someone from the bench. I mean, oftentimes I'm very open, you cannot nod your head at me because I will not see. So please speak up from the bench, which is something, and probably Judge Schutte does the same. I may not have heard you because I have, hearing loss. And so those aren't things that you usually have heard from that side of the bench. But I think there's also a corollary to that. And that's like kind of the behind the scenes things that you don't know that are slowly moving, and the influence that you're having or the education you're having on colleagues, on court staff. Recently the website for the state judicial department is going to need to be updated to be in compliance with a new law that it's ADA accessible. And one of the things that I've been urging them to do is to say, make sure that you are getting in users who are actually disabled, who are like tooling around on this website. So it's not just you thinking this is what the ADA says and this is what a technical compliance manual says, but like what actually is, going to be user faced by a person with a disability and how that's working. Same thing with the judicial. There's at the Ralph Carr Court where there's the AG's office is on one side and a lot of other state legal built offices, but the appellate courts are on the other side. There's a learning center that the public can go to learn about the law. It's interactive, it's electronic, it's really fun. It is needing to be updated because the technology is out of date already, even though it was built in 2012. And so again, like I'm bringing in people from the CDBA to say, walk around, roll around in your wheelchair, access these panels, these interfaces. Tell us if we had our druthers, because it is the state after all, if we had our druthers budget wise, what would we need to do? So it's those kinds of things that I think were just not, it's not that I don't think that you had well-intentioned people being like, well, obviously we need to comply with the ADA and obviously this is important to have access, but you just didn't have the understanding of like somebody actually who had that experience to say, but you need to actually do a little bit more. Same thing with language. I mean, in terms of how we speak about disability or just talking about it in a way where it may not change the outcome of a decision. I mean, it's like, unfortunately, your parental rights are still going to be terminated. But are we going to acknowledge in a decision, a judicial opinion, that this is actually very hard, or that we hope the department will make more effort in the future where that language may not have been there before because you have a different perspective from somebody who just says, well, it looks like they complied with the ADA. And it's like, well, I don't know if they actually did, but I also think it doesn't necessarily change the decision because of X, Y, and Z. And so it's things like that on the back end that I don't think people really appreciate how much the diversity, whether it's disability or gender or racial, socioeconomic, brings to the bench in those behind the scenes decisions as well.
Absolutely. And in our last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to ask you both, is there anything else you want our listeners to know?
Well, from my perspective, listeners who find themselves in court, if they want to observe, if they're a juror, if they are a litigant, reach out to the ADA coordinator and make sure that you're getting what you need to participate. Even if you just want to come and watch, these are open courts and they have to provide accommodations even to observers. And if you're a lawyer listening, interested in someone with a disability that wants to join our bar association, we would love to have you. If you're an ally, we would love to have you. And thank you for having us both.
Absolutely. Judge Johnson, was there anything else you wanted our listeners to know today?
I just hope that, hearing from Judge Schutte and me, that anyone listening out there who hadn't thought that they could go to law school because they had a disability or couldn't be appointed to the bench, that they kind of rethink that, because I think there's such value to actually think, okay, I don't think I thought I could do it. And I don't know if Judge Schutte thought the same thing. And now you're here and you're going, well, I am kind of doing it. But I think it's really important. I mean, that's part of the front facing of it, of like going, not just is this person going to hear me and understand me, but also seeing in that person themselves and trying to strive for that. And so I really encourage people who haven't thought about law school or who are in law school and have a disability to basically reach out as well, because we have lots of mentors who have gone through this, who have practiced oftentimes kind of in the shadows without disclosing a disability, and you don't need to, and you have lots of resources. So we just really appreciate you letting us be here and sharing a little bit of what we do.
Well, I want to extend my sincerest thanks to both of you for being here. Judge Johnson and Judge Schutte, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Tess Stanton, and Jessica Lucania is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, grant number 90DPAD0014. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.